Welcome, everybody, to our virtual panel entitled Shifting Towards Crisis Mobility. I'm retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe, now serving as the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, D.C. I'm speaking to you today from Frankfurt, Germany. Our panel today is the second in CEPA's monthly series on the topic of military mobility. These panels are building up to our military mobility workshop, which we'll conduct in October this year in Brussels. The workshop will use 5 different working groups to examine 5 scenarios touching all of Europe, from Scandinavia to the Baltics, to the Black Sea, to the Balkans, and to the Mediterranean, and involving nearly 150 representatives and experts from all across Nato, each of the relevant agencies of the European Union and the European Parliament, several European national headquarters, multiple think tanks, relevant industry including rail, cyber, bridging, wheeled and tracked vehicles, and air and missile defense, and professional journalists. In this era of great power competition and the return to deterrence to ensure the security of allies and friends in Europe, the topic of military mobility has taken on increased significance for military planners. Several studies have been published in the past few months, including by RAND, the Swedish Defense Research Agency, FOI, the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, and the Atlantic Council, each of which helped advance the understanding and importance of military mobility. And yet the significance and sense of urgency needed to fix it are still not fully understood, and efforts to improve military mobility have thus far fallen short of what remains to be done. Complicating the challenge further, the context for our discussion has changed significantly over the last few weeks as we all deal with the coronavirus pandemic. European nations closing borders on short notice to contain the spread of the virus has highlighted the challenges to improving cross-border mobility and resulted in the interruptions of the flow of medicine and medical supplies, badly needed seasonal labor, and citizens trying to get back to their homes to comply with governmental orders. The curtailment of major military exercises such as Defender 20 reminded us of the potential impact of pandemics on military readiness and deterrence. Budget pressures will cause governments to re-examine priorities as they look to salvage severely damaged economies. Yet, all of the threats that existed 6 months ago are still with us, and they'll be with us 6 months from now. So how do we continue the effort to improve military mobility within this context? Perhaps we need to look at the need for crisis mobility, not just military mobility. Today's panel of experts and skilled practitioners will help us find a way within this new context to identify concrete recommendations for improving mobility in Europe, raise awareness of its importance, and build momentum to resourcing and implementing those recommendations. I want to introduce now our great panel. Ms. Tanya Letici works as a policy analyst in Brussels in the European Parliament's in-house think tank, covering security and defense policy and producing reports and analysis for members of the European Parliament. She has also worked for the Nato Parliamentary Assembly and the European External Action Service. Tanya is also working on her PhD on transatlantic defense cooperation at the University of Ghent. Greg Meltzer is the Chief Operations Officer for the New Generation Warfare Center in Arlington, Virginia, where he conducts operational and strategic level simulations, European American security dialogues, and analysis studies for allied countries and industry. He is also affiliated with Virginia Tech University. Prior to this, he spent 27 years as a civilian working for the United States Navy and then led the National Security Analysis Mission Area at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. Group Captain Elizabeth Purcell, a Royal Air Force logistics officer, has served in a variety of important logistics and transportation assignments, including deployments to Sierra Leone, Afghanistan twice, and Iraq, and commanded RAF Airport Bryce-Norton. In November 2010, her second tour in Afghanistan, she managed the UK's Force Movements Control Cell, responsible for coordinating the air and surface flow of personnel and equipment to and from theater. In August of 2011, she served in the UK's Ministry of Defense, responsible for deployment of UK forces home from Afghanistan. Group Captain Purcell has served at SHAPE in Mons, Belgium since March of 2016, initially managing the Allied Movements Coordination Center and from mid-2018, serving as head of logistics planning. She is currently the lead officer for the NATO Enablement Plan and also plays a key role in the NATO COVID-19 task force. Dr. Jacek Bartosiak, our fourth and final panelist, is the CEO and founder of Strategy and Future, based in Warsaw, Poland, where he is an expert on operational concepts of modern warfare in Central and Eastern Europe, NATO's eastern flank, and the Western Pacific. He has also contributed to several large transportation projects in Poland and Central and Eastern Europe. Okay, let's get to work. For all of our listeners on Zoom, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Type in your questions and we'll get to as many as possible. I anticipate at about the halfway mark, in about 25 minutes, we will be going to questions from the audience. Our first question is to Tanya Letici. Tanya, what do you think are some of the immediate post-coronavirus crisis effects that we can expect to see in the defense sphere?
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, CEPA, for having me back, actually. Yeah, well, you know, when we see the expert prognoses painting a picture that is going to look worse than the 2008 global financial crisis or the Great Depression, I think it's pretty clear that defense is also going to be affected. Now, understandably, attention, money, and politics, all of them are now focused on the virus, on combating it, on containing it, and eradicating it. However, literally vital the current crisis management is, I think it is equally important that the crisis management is accompanied by crisis prevention and crisis preparedness. And of course, military mobility is a key element of that. And as you, Ben, also pointed out, geopolitical conflicts and tensions have not been put on pause. On the contrary, I think we see that that crises, as history also teaches us, accelerate current trends. We see now that Russia is violating international and sovereign airspace. We see that the Islamic State is becoming more and more active in the Middle East. So crises are likely going to be accelerated. Now, as it tended to happen in times of economic hardships in Europe, but not only in Europe, defense expenditure has tended to be kind of the sacrificial lamb, as I remember one expert rather candidly put it. So while this might be the first instinct for our political leaders to cut defense and shift money from defense to other sectors that are currently considered to be more crucial, such as healthcare. Now I will be the last one to say that we shouldn't invest in healthcare. I'm Romanian. My country, men and women, are protesting for better healthcare for ages. But what I am against is seeing these two budgetary allocations as purely competing with each other, when instead I think they should be seen as two puzzle pieces, part of a wider picture, as goes to show their contribution to our societies. Of course, for me, this is very easy to say. I'm not a politician. My career doesn't depend on making these budgetary decisions. But still, I think the added value of civil military approaches and of the defense and healthcare approaches have been beautifully showcased during this crisis, when we see the military being in the front lines, assisting civilian authorities in battling the crisis. So even though in many European countries, I think it's still the case, and I'm wrapping up with this, it's still the case that the military evokes rather negative historical connotations. But I think the swift reaction and the substantial contribution of the military came to challenge this perspective quite a bit. So finally, I think defense is unfortunately quite likely to be among the sectors affected. But personally, and here I'm accompanied by a wider range of experts, I think that the best shot we have is to advocate for a long-headed, inclusive risk assessment when crunching these future budgets.
Tanya, thanks. Let me ask a quick follow-up. So many of the borders were shut inside the Schengen zone with almost no prior coordination or notification. Do you anticipate that these will all open up back to normal soon, or do you anticipate maybe a lag or a reluctance to open back up the way it was pre-pandemic?
Well, I think it's not in the interest of any EU member state to not come back to normal. I certainly don't see it as such. If I think a bit more about how the EU could act to mitigate this impact or to facilitate the coming back to normal part, I think we could, I think the EU could play the role of the optimist in this classic joke on what is the difference between a pessimist and an optimist, where the pessimist says things can't get any worse, and the optimist says yes, they can. So in this sense, I think the EU can play a much more important role. It already is, but I think it can up its action in this regard in member states, but also with partners, in terms of reminding that security challenges can still get worse, and that at the moment we cannot afford to let our guard down. So in this sense, I think the EU has quite a valuable contribution to bring. As for the post-pandemic landscape, I think political leaders shouldn't only think about the cost of doing it. I think, yes, defense is expensive to do, but what about the costs of not doing it? I think that's something we should keep in mind.
Great, thank you very much. Let me turn now to Mr. Greg Meltzer from the New Strategy Center, or New Generation Warfare Center, excuse me. Greg, you've done a lot of work, simulations with several countries inside the United States, but also with several allied countries. Could you give me a little bit of the background on the simulation work you've been doing in Europe and how that might relate to military mobility? Why do we do simulations?
No, thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me, and to CEPA, appreciate the opportunity. We've been conducting operational strategic simulations on what I call the new front for NATO. That's stretching from Svalbard up in the Arctic through the Nordic states and Baltic Sea, down to the Black Sea, and then into the Eastern Mediterranean. And we've looked at simulations in all these regions, sometimes with states, sometimes separately funded. They're mostly focused on what front-facing nations will counter and deal with in the full range of new generation warfare threats. So I'm speaking of both non-kinetic or hybrid activities, along with kinetic or conventional warfare, and even threats of nuclear use. Most of the time, these simulations include some degree of computerized movement of forces and attrition calculations in real time, but others are more just tabletop, exploring scenario vignettes and operational strategic trade-offs. We started with a focus on the Baltic states and Poland. In fact, Jacek, who will speak in a little bit, participated in all those simulations. But that work, together with what RAND has done and a more recent study by Dr. Hooker, all came to similar conclusions. It'll be tough to stop aggressive action, and it's likely that the mission will be to dislodge an occupying power. The best we can do is slow them down at this point. And my conclusion is that this is a driver behind some recent efforts, such as Defender 2020 and the 30-30-30-30 strategy. So if I can kind of wrap up, having done about 20 of these, some basic assumptions of why we usually find out the Allies win. And most of them have military mobility implications. First, typically, political decisions are made in a timely way that raise readiness levels and have local forces mobilized and deployed when they're supposed to. Next, we always assume that the Allied reinforcement is timely and successful. And in order for that to happen, transportation infrastructure exists to enable that reinforcement. And of course, these are things which are not actually true. Further, typically we have plenty of logistics and ammunition in the right place, and pre-positioned equipment is where it's supposed to be. And finally, allies are trained and interoperable in the region that we're looking at. So, this often is not true and is a challenge that gets to it. And if you dig a little bit deeper, I think when you look in Europe, it kind of a couple conclusions about some critical infrastructure for mobility would be required is one is, first of all, some sort of degree of major transportation hub is likely needed in Poland and Romania. We see them as the two key land centers of gravity in Europe for any conflict. And then my last point is that there really is a need for high-speed rail transport needed east-west and north-south, basically Gdansk to Constanta. And with that, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I'm particularly interested in your experiences, the simulations you've run with the Romanian General Staff. You've got challenging geography, infrastructure, and of course, you're on the Black Sea. What are some of the insights that you've gotten from your time on the ground there, as well as the simulations of the military mobility challenges that'll have to be addressed?
Yeah, certainly. What's become obvious from the simulations in both Poland and Romania is that Romania is definitely more isolated than Poland. Like the Sawaki Gap or Corridor, there's a similar piece of terrain known as the Foshan Gate, which has been a historic pathway into or out of Romania. And controlling that gate is very important. The defense of Romania will be more of a come as you are fight. It's harder to get there. That means heavy equipment such as an M1 tank that needs to be pre-positioned. Ammunition and POL need to be pre-positioned. Airfields need to be prepared to receive transport aircraft, be ready to unload them and move men, equipment, and supplies where they need to go within the country. From military mobility point of view, there are 3 rail line paths that are more or less moved from the northwest to the southeast through the country, above, through, and below the Carpathians. All 3 require upgrade, and at this point, the primary focus there is for commercial purposes. I don't think they're thinking enough about the military requirements. It's unlikely, I think, that you can get much to Romania by sea, but that depends on the situation. Operations potentially use the Danube River, and then there's certainly a lot of barge traffic there. And the Romanians also maintain a pretty robust riverine forces to help protect that area. So that is an area that should be explored in more detail. And then I guess the last thing is, I think in many cases here, Romanian airfields need to be hardened. And the important early decisions to mobilize and deploy out of the garrison is critical to success in this region. And so I'll turn it back to you there.
Okay. Hey, thanks. Just as a reminder to our listeners, you've got the opportunity to send in questions. We've got questions that are starting to come in already. If you want to type in a question on using the Q&A function on Zoom, you'll be welcome to join us. Let me turn now to Group Captain Elizabeth Purcell from SHAPE, Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. Liz, could you describe the challenges that COVID-19 is posing to military mobility from a NATO perspective, and give me some insights into how NATO is trying to tackle these?
Good afternoon. Yes, of course, General, of course. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So NATO, of course, is made up of 30 members. We've got 30 allies plus partners on top of that. And what we have is consensus amongst those allies, and that's one of our greatest strengths. The absolute aim of NATO, and I speak on behalf of NATO, not as a British officer, is to obviously assist the allies wherever possible during this difficult time. And the challenge, wearing my NATO hat, is that I have very limited stuff with which to help the nations, and I have absolutely no transport assets. So all this belongs to the nations, and it's a bit of a 3-dimensional problem. So it's their stuff, but I'm within an umbrella organisation where national human nature reaches to get help during difficult times. So what NATO has done to tackle this challenge, we've established a task force for COVID-19. It's a cross-functional task force, and I'm a key member of that team. We have a disaster relief coordination centre set up in Brussels 24/7, and they're taking requests in from the nations, be it for PPE equipment, ventilators, for example, or even just for lift. Those responses go into Brussels and then are spread around the other allies asking for help. The strategic headquarters at SHAPE maintains oversight of the response to those requests, and we help out where we can, of course. For example, with strategic lift, the North Atlantic Council in Brussels has approved the use of the NATO air call sign OAN, so an aircraft flying on behalf of COVID relief from a NATO nation can use the call sign OAN 1234, and that gives Eurocontrol in Brussels visibility of what is moving COVID relief across Europe. It doesn't necessarily speed up the flight, but it does give visibility, and that counts for a lot. So I've said we don't really have, NATO doesn't have much stuff to help with. What I have got is some accommodation stores, some tentage, some ablutions, some air conditioning units, and that's held in southern Italy. So some nations have requested use of that, and we have deployed a 300-man tentage capability with ablutions to help one of the nations, one of our allies, during the COVID crisis. So that's a good thing. And obviously the task force helps to plan that, pack the kit, move the kit, and then roll it out at the other end. So we're pretty busy. And the other point I'd like to make is about a military mobility network being in place. Ben mentioned the fact Defender 20 was unfortunately cut short. What a missed opportunity that was. But of course, NATO has some kit, some stuff on that exercise, and it got stuck in Hungary because, of course, borders were starting to be shut. The way NATO got around that was we mobilized our network, we contacted people in the different nations involved with the closed borders, and we got our stuff through. So having a network in place is absolutely essential. Back to you, Ben.
So, Group Captain Purcell, Liz, thanks. You've got a lot of experience in the various NATO sort of movement coordination organizations. Could you, in a couple of minutes, just briefly describe what NATO actually has in place? I think many of us were discovering that the alliance has real capability necessary to move things around to plan it. Could you just name a couple of those and talk about how they fit in?
I'm sorry, the sound broke up there. Could you repeat that question?
Yeah, it's the different movement coordination cells, the organizations that exist that the alliance has or uses. Could you talk briefly about those?
Yes, of course, yes. Okay, so within NATO itself, we have the Allied Movements Coordination Centre, which has a key role of coordinating and deconflicting any move on behalf of NATO. So for a military operation, the commander decides what order he wants stuff to arrive in, and the AMCC coordinates that on behalf of NATO. In addition to that, the majority of NATO member nations are members of the Movement Coordination Centre Europe, which is based at Eindhoven in the Netherlands. And that effectively optimizes lift, both air and surface, and they can pay for using lift, but using flying hours. And it's effectively a broker. It's a broker for military mobility, and it's an extremely useful organization. So if a nation comes to NATO and say, I'm having problems moving stuff, yes, I can go out and ask the other nations, but I can also say to that nation, have you spoken to the MCCE? It's a non-NATO organization, but it's a really good broker to optimize the use of lift. I'll stop there, sir.
Okay, no, that's exactly what I was looking for. The next question is going to be to Jacek, but I want to give Greg Meltzer a heads up so he can be thinking about it. One of the questions that's already come in is the Kremlin capable of launching a major Crimea-like attack in the Baltics, Ukraine, or Georgia at this time of the coronavirus, while perhaps we are all diverted, or to divert Russians away from Putin's problems at home? So Greg, that will be coming to you first. So I want to give you a chance to think about it. Jacek, so you're one of our 5 work group leaders for the workshop that we're doing, and specifically you've got the scenario that involves moving military capability from Germany up through the Sawaki Corridor into Lithuania. Describe for us what the Sawaki Corridor is. Why do we call it that? What are the major challenges associated with rapid movement to and through the Sawaki Corridor?
Okay, thank you, Ben. Thank you for having me here at this panel. And of course, it's a great question pertaining exactly to the essence of the issue of mobility, speed of reaction, and forcing moving forces into the Baltic states. So Tsubaki Corridor is a very peculiar area. It is the area sandwiched between the Kaliningrad enclave in Russian hands, Belarusia, and Lithuania and Poland. Actually, we call it Sawaki Corridor, roughly 80 kilometers of the border between Poland and Lithuania that this territory is flanked from the Russian Kaliningrad enclave and from the Belarusian territory, which is supposedly under the Russian control in terms of the power projection capabilities. That creates a nightmare for logistic supply of the forces in the Baltic states. On top of that, it's not everything. The terrain through which you need to deliver forces and project power is composing of many lakes, many rivers, small rivers, big rivers, many crossings, forested areas, so that there are clear channels of movement that can be easily obstructed from the flanking positions in Kaliningrad and in Belarus. And because it's not a flat terrain where you can many axes of approaches, you can easily predict which way to go. And actually, there are only two roads, one bigger, the other one's narrower, more neglected, leading from Poland into Lithuania. And there is only one railway of limited capacity, also leading from Poland to Lithuania and from Lithuania to Poland. And on top of that, also deeper in Poland, the network, the highway network system and the railway network system is creating vulnerabilities. So if Russians really wanted to exploit the predicted channels of movement within Poland from Warsaw to Sawaki Corridor, they could also create problems if using long fires or some offensive capabilities, or even a sort of army being, a sort of a threat, emanating threat that would be stalling, for example, Polish forces from keeping the corridor open. And here I mean particularly the eastern approach to Warsaw, which is quite close to the Belarusian border, on the flat terrain, tank terrain, easy to maneuver, easy to move on Warsaw, as opposed to Sawaki Corridor.
Gotcha. Thanks for saying that. Some people refer to it as the Sawaki Gap, but at CEPA we call it the Sawaki Corridor because, of course, the corridor is something you want to keep open, which is what we want to do. We want to make sure that that corridor that connects Poland up to our Baltic allies remains open, whereas in the old days, the Fulda Gap, of course, was something that we wanted to be able to block. So an important distinction. Jacek, if I could follow up on one thing with you. There was an article came out yesterday from Estonia talking about that the Rail Baltica program had been stopped. This is a partly EU-funded program that will provide rail using European rail gauge from Poland all the way up to Tallinn. This looks like it was a little bit of internal domestic politics involved, and the government has obviously not canceled their portion of it. But it does seem like there's been some challenges with the Rail Baltica project, that it should be further along. Could you talk about what would help facilitate completion of that important project?
Sure, a great question. And that pertains to the broad strategic view of the Central and Eastern Europe. Actually, over the last 200 years, usually there were parallel highways and roads from Russia to Germany, from Germany to Russia, across all those countries, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states. And there was not so much of north and south linkage and connectivity. And that also had impact on economy, on the relations between businesses, towns, cities were built, and so on and so forth. So there are vested interests, or at least vested perceptions, how connectivity should be developed, especially among the stronger partners in terms, for example, Germans and the European Union. While the region itself, and here I see the 3 Cs initiative as a great step forward, is lacking the north and south connectivity. If we, for example, connected southern front, like both Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, we would not only create the new economy in terms of some synergy of markets, of resources, but also we would create the internal line of communication between Romania and potentially through Western Ukraine up to Estonia through the center of gravity in Poland. And that would create a completely new strategic dimensions for Russians. And that would consolidate using the internal line of communication allowed by geography. That would create a lot of problems for Russians planning, for Russian exercises, for Russian, force correlation ratio that they always use to monitor the situation all along the Western boundary. So this is a critically both economically and also strategically project, in my personal opinion.
Great, thanks very much. So Greg, back to you. One of our audience members has asked, is the Kremlin capable of launching a major Crimea-like attack in the Baltics or Ukraine or Georgia at this time, where perhaps we might be distracted by the coronavirus? You've looked at some of those kind of things in your simulations. What do you think?
Ben, yeah, so I guess first to address would be, the readiness status of how has the virus impacted the Russian forces, which we don't really have the answer to. But I'll just make this comment that in the case of the aircraft carrier that got all the controversy, at all points, that ship was ready to fight, even today. So, even if you have 500 kids who have the virus, it's not really impacting younger people that badly. So they're ready to go. So they are capable and able to do it. And further, I think, for example, they are planning the Caucasus series of exercises coming up here in the end of the summer. And I know Ukraine is particularly worried about that because they'll be doing all kinds of things in the Black Sea, testing out their cruise missiles. There's rumor that they're going to try their hypersonic missiles. So I think it's a big concern. So I think NATO and EU countries need to remain vigilant and continue to keep the focus and understanding that the military is ready to respond even in these times of crisis.
Great, thank you. Next question from our audience. This will be to Group Captain Purcell. Liz, our audience member wants to know, could you please explain the role of the Joint Sustainment and Enabling Command there in Ulm, Germany? The JSEC.
Yes, of course. The NATO command structure was adapted and reorganized over the last couple of years. And the Joint Support and Enabling Command was established as a new, effectively, Joint Force Command. It's an operational level headquarters. It's currently at IOC. It's building up now, so it's in its infancy. NATO became very aware of the fact that we have operational level commands to cover large geographic areas, but nobody was really looking at the middle bit. The purpose of JSEC will be to have a look at force protection and security in that middle landmass in Europe, but it is still under development, and the exact roles and responsibilities are being defined.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, I really believe that the sooner that the JSEC gets involved in exercises and really works out the reporting, because I think there's still some uncertainty about who reports to who and what area they're responsible for, their connectivity with the Joint Forces Command, and so on. And really, you have to do exercises to figure that all out. Okay, Greg, back to you. Romanian armed forces have flirted with the idea of modernizing their helicopter fleet, both attack and utility platforms. How would acquisition of 40 or 50 aircraft change how Romania might respond to an aggressive move by Russia? And why do helicopters make a difference in Romania, maybe more so than in other places?
Sure, yes. We've, all our simulations, we played having Apache helicopters available. Some would be part of the Romanian Air Forces, but probably the thing that's relevant here is the fact that the ability of the helicopter force to get into the country quickly when the classic rail lines and others are difficult to get heavy forces into the country. So if Romania planned to be able to host the US, UK, Netherlands, Apache squadrons could all reinforce and come into the country. And of course, that anti-armor capability on that aircraft makes a big difference on any of the three axes that you might see an attack either coming down from Moldova into the Foshan Gate or up the river with riverine forces, or in any sort of amphibious approach that would go across the Danube. And frankly, they were the game changer in most of those simulations.
Thanks. So the next question that we have is about reliance on river traffic as a line of communication. You don't normally associate barges on the Rhine or the Danube or the Vistula as being rapid, but nonetheless, the need for sustainment over time and for moving bulk product. I'd like to, our audience wants to know in terms of is there planning on use of rivers? And then Greg, in your simulations, and Jacek, your own experience, the use of rivers historically, and then of course this project that the EU calls the E40 that connects rivers and canals that would go through Poland, Belarus, and Ukraine. What's the value, significance of rivers? So let me go Liz, then Greg, and then Jacek.
Of course. So any means of transport is a useful thing, absolutely. And more important than I think speed of movement is making sure things are happening in the right order and getting to their final destination in the right order. So when we're doing deployment planning from a NATO perspective, the nations provide the strategic lift, and if they wish to move their forces by river or by canal, they know the date it needs to get to the final destination. And as long as they can factor that into the equation, absolutely more than welcome. We'll use as many means of transport as we can, because as we all know, lift is never there when you need it. So use everything you've got. Thank you.
Greg?
Yeah, so in our simulations, we haven't really used them from a military mobility point of view, but if you look at the Foshan Gate, the city of Galat is probably the key point in the whole equation, and controlling that city really helps to control the gate as well as control the river traffic. So in some of the conflicts we looked at, the river was more used as a way to get into the country and defending against it. But however, I think in the workshop, when we look at that, there's no reason we can't explore in more detail what sort of reinforcements can come from west to east using the Danube. It's very navigable, very big area. And anytime you see it, it's just full of barges going back and forth, bringing all kinds of equipment, primarily for commercial purposes, but there's no reason they can't be used also for military reasons. Over.
Okay, in Poland itself, navigable rivers flow south-north, which means that for the NATO forces, they usually are the barrier that you need to cross to reinforce Poland and the Baltic states. And apart from big rivers like the Vistula, there are also thousands of little streams, small streams, creeks, and something like that. That's why usually the tanks, Soviet tanks and German tanks, were lighter than American tanks, because east of the Oder River, the European peninsula is more of rivers and streams and so on and so forth. And we need to admit that Russians know it. They are good at crossing. They are good at field engineering corps, and they have the equipment that is with them to make a crossing. And they know the theater by heart. If you want to reach up to to Vilnius, to Tallinn, and to Riga, you really need to cross a lot of crossings. And also in the Baltic states, the Nemunas River is winding like that. So sometimes I think we should have a lot of crossings prepared in advance. And usually infrastructure is not as advanced as in the West, which means that there are not so many bridges, and especially bridges that can hold the Abrams tank. So this is a critical challenge. As regards this waterway that you have mentioned, of course, in terms of economy, it's a big project. It would be a spine of the 3 Cs of the Intermarium, if it materializes. Okay, because it's true, you can really transport bulk goods across the river like that, and it would be a great waterway connecting those economies. And it has been contemplated in the past. hopefully, this way or another, it will be delivered. In terms of Sawaki Corridor, in terms of the speed of reaction and speed of movement, it doesn't alter the correlation of forces and it doesn't impact the strategic situation on the NATO eastern flank. But the rivers, as I said, matter a lot here.
Gotcha. Thanks very much. This next question from the audience, it's about cooperation between the European Union and NATO. So I'm going to turn to Tanya first and then to Liz. From your perspectives, why is this cooperation so important, and how would you assess where it is right now? It gets talked about all the time as a great nexus of cooperation, but it's not always visible that it's happening.
Thanks, Ben. You know, whenever I have to talk about EU-NATO cooperation, I'd like to use the comparison with stray cats. I think the EU and NATO before used to behave like stray cats who de facto shared the same conceptual and physical territory, but each had their own turf, and there was this kind of silent agreement that you stay out of my turf and I stay out of yours. Now, I think military mobility was a key stimulus for realizing that, well, actually, we can better defend our common turf by actually working together. So in this sense, I think military mobility has been a key showcase of showing how where NATO's end, this is where the EU's instruments begin, because they simply have different mandates. So it's the added value of the civil military approach at hand. Because military mobility itself has a very rich landscape of things on the to-do list that have to be checked. They include not only infrastructure, but also customs, diplomatic clearances, taxation, healthcare, and all of these aspects that the EU knows much more how to do because it simply is in its remit than NATO does. And I think there has been a huge amount of cooperation and coordination that doesn't happen, of course, in the public eye, but much more than before. So both are learning how to work with each other. And speaking with counterparts from NATO, but also from the EU institutions that are engaging with our NATO colleagues, the feedback has been almost always extremely positive.
Thanks. Liz.
Yes, thank you. That was very eloquently put by Tanya there. What I will say is that there's a great deal of structured dialogue, that's what they call it, happening between our political headquarters in Brussels and the EU. It's permanently happening. There are lots of structured dialogue meetings happening. We're both trying to do, NATO and EU are both trying to do military mobility. We've got to avoid duplication of efforts. We've got to learn from each other. We've got to learn from each other, and it is a showcase, and there is real progress there. But you know, people want to see results, but this is going to take time. This is going to take time, and Europe needs to just have a bit of patience as these structured dialogues continue, and as we avoid duplication, and as we learn from each other, and we'll put it in place. It takes time. Thank you.
So I've got an interesting question about bridging here, and I want to go through this question and then think about which of you might be able to offer the best response. It's about what the military refers to as line of communication bridging. So not assault bridging for getting across the river in the attack, but the bridges that are required for all the traffic, the sustainment that comes along the roads to keep the fight going, to continue support operations. And right now for the U.S., the priority for line of communication bridging is to the Indo-Pacific theater. The second priority is U.S. Army in Europe. Liz, I think I'm going to turn to you first in terms of procurement by the nations, bridging stock, to have it on hand to meet the line of communication requirements, and the various planning exercises you've been in, the work you've done to look at line of communication requirements. Is it feasible to think that nations might increase their stocks of bridging? And of course, military bridging can have dual use value in terms of time of spring floods, for example. How is SHAPE looking at line of communication bridging?
Okay, so well, infrastructure generally is one of the key tenets of us setting requirements for military mobility. We need to be able to understand what infrastructure is actually in place out there. We do deployment planning. We're building a database with input from the nations as to what infrastructure is in place. That gets updated every year. And, you know, again, it takes time. It's getting better all the time. We've got a much better understanding than we had 3 or 4 years ago of what infrastructure is in place. Getting the nations to spend money on infrastructure, that's the difficult bit. That's the difficult bit. Yeah, we can encourage the allies to provide the infrastructure that's needed. We can't make them spend money on it. But through the deployment planning we're doing with the allies, we're making it very clear to them just what their infrastructure needs to be able to do, if that helps.
Yeah, thanks. Hey, Greg, I want to come back to you. You know, some of the simulations you've done also were up in the Baltic countries. One of our listeners is asking for insights from the various simulations you and wargaming that you did with up in Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania.
I guess I can make a few comments. It's not really military mobility related, but I think a couple of conclusions we had is that the borders are particularly defendable if all the energy is put to the border end. What typically happens is these countries all drop back and defend the capital, whereas I think they could get more time if they put the resources on the border. If you look at the geographical situation and go walk and look where the marshes are and the bodies of water and things like that. I think that's one of the big conclusions that came from that. I mean, ultimately, if a full Russian army or armies is going at that, and it's before forces can get there from either NATO or the rest of Europe, they'll ultimately probably prevail, but still they can be slowed down quite a bit. And in some circumstances, as NATO continues to address the problem with their ongoing exercises we talked about, like Defender, I think they can eventually come up with schemes where they could be able to get reinforcements there in time to perhaps stop even a Russian army.
Thank you. You know, you remind me that when we talk about deterrence is about having capability and demonstrating capability. And what underpins a capability is speed, speed of recognition, speed of decision, and speed of assembly. How quickly can we recognize that something is happening and then get a political decision to begin movement? And then physically, how fast can you actually assemble and be somewhere? And we're talking about either to prevent a crisis or to prevent a crisis from getting out of hand. And of course, that means that all of this movement is going to happen in peacetime conditions. All the EU road regulations, national road regulations, all of that will remain in effect. Military will be competing with businesses for rail, for example, or even other forms of commercial transportation. So the speed of recognition is really key, and to get the information that's compelling enough that political leaders would authorize the start of movement, knowing that none of them will want to do anything that looks like it's provocative or escalatory. So in that light, one of our listeners has asked, what's the opinion of your guests regarding NATO supporting Romania to develop a consistent early warning system at the Black Sea? What would be the Russian reaction? How about Greg, let's go to you first, and I'll give the rest of you a chance to think about that. The significance of early warning systems, might those be seen as provocative, and what's needed in Romania?
Yeah, well, certainly, as you know, there's a multinational division headquarters there, and talk of maybe having a multinational core, which could help do some degree of that surveillance. There's at MK Airport, there's a policing mission, which could grow to be more of a surveillance mission. There's the Romanian program to buy 4 corvettes with a very capable anti-ship missile that's in the process of procurement. tied up in legal issues at the moment, but I think it'll probably go forward eventually. And then another idea is a friend of mine, Tom Mankin, and the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments just done a report on how, highly detectable UAVs that can be seen out there can be a good screen and ones that they can actually see to use as an early warning. So I think given the steps that Russia is taking, what they've done in the Azov Sea, almost closing it down, controlling the Kerch Strait, I don't think that any of those things could be considered to be more provocative to anything that they've already done in the Black Sea, particularly if Romania keeps it at least within their EEZ zone. And then again, the last thought is there are quite a bit of oil rigs out there. And I'm told from my Ukraine friends that the Russians are occupying some of the ones that are in the Crimean EEZ with their special ops troops. So why would it be inappropriate for at least surveillance assets to be on those oil rigs, which are in the Romanian EEZ, to keep an eye and a watch out there, given that they don't have the level of naval capabilities that the Russians have coming out of the Crimea port there. Over to you.
Jacek, any thought?
Yeah, I fully agree with Greg. By all means, we need the warning system, the situational awareness capabilities, whatever you call it, all along the eastern frontier, as we say, or eastern front, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, where we have the pickets of drones and sensors. And I think we should be more proactive, because so far we've been reactive. The Russians make a move, they even demonstrate the potential of move, and then we react this way or another. It's too little, too slow, and too late very often. And I think that the Russians have been waging the non-linear and limited warfare in Eastern Europe, and with great success, so to speak. I mean, we can discuss whether they will deliver it at the end of the day. Their statehood is broke, but they seized Crimea, they control the Azov Sea, they broke the Donbass, they threatened Baltic states, and there are many islands, for example, in the Black Sea. Again, if I could return to this idea of connecting Poland and Romania with this connectivity, imagine what would happen if we could quickly deploy our own coastal batteries, anti-ship missiles to Constanza. So the Russians would be threatened to move from Crimea to the Bosphorus even, okay? And we would make a move that would put them into the defensive posture, and that would make them spend money on additional assets, and they don't have too much money. So that would be a net assessment advantage. And I could make a full plethora of ideas how we could change the posture from reactive to proactive to contain Russia. That's my general assessment, that we have been too reactive to the situation, and the geography creates us chances if we are proactive. That the same is in the Baltic states, Gotland, the many islands there, Gulf of Riga, Huma, Sarema. We played. If we prevent Russians from creating anti-accessory denial capabilities in the Baltic state. Back to you.
Jacek, thanks. I think your friends in the Kremlin were trying to jam you right there. They didn't like what you were saying. Liz, a question to you, and then I'll come back to Tanya very quickly. This is a short question. What is the status of the common standard operating procedures on movement for NATO countries? Liz, could you talk to that?
Okay, so I talked about infrastructure as one of our key tenets for setting the requirements for military mobility. Another key tenet is authorities and legislation. So I would suggest that moving stuff in peacetime is probably the most complicated bit of any large-scale move, because all nations will have their authorities and legislation in place. And you're absolutely right, it's a good point. We have to try and get some sort of standardization across the piece. So NATO is working to that with the allies, and certain elements of standardization have been requested by the NAC to the nations, by the North Atlantic Council. Not all is in place yet. There will always be the bureaucratic procedure to fill in paperwork to cross a border. We are doing our best to standardise it. But again, you know, it just takes time. It just takes time.
Okay, thank you. There was a question specifically here for Tanya that I want to get to. No, that was about Romanian domestic politics. We'll pass on that one since it doesn't affect military mobility. Tanya, let me ask this. This question is also directed for you. What is the status of the EU's PESCO military mobility project as of right now?
So the PESCO project on military mobility is only one element of the military mobility landscape, together with the action plan by the Commission, together with EU-NATO cooperation, and is also a binding commitment under PESCO. So the Netherlands is in the lead of this project, and it has 24 participating member states, just as a background. But the added value of this project in particular, I think, has a much more of a political dimension of bringing member states together around the table, getting consensus, and kind of motivating them to put in the money to do the work. And this is also, I think, very relevant in the context of the negotiations for the EU's next budget. So it also brings value there. The current PESCO projects, including military mobility, are currently actually being assessed. So there's a strategic review of PESCO where for each project, they are going to assess exactly what is working, what is not working, what can be improved. But overall, I think the PESCO project on military mobility has seen the most interest from all member states, and especially because it has such wide-ranging relevance for all of these different defense actors. I think it's one of the best positioned to also demonstrate the added value of PESCO as such.
Tanya, thank you very much. Okay, here's how we're going to do this. I've got one last question that'll go to Group Captain Purcell from Lieutenant General retired Heiner Braus. And then I'm going to come back to all four of you. It'll be the lightning round. You get 1 minute to say that one thing that you really wanted to drive home that you didn't get to say during the course of the Q&A that we've had, but that you want to leave our loyal listeners with, and then I'll wrap up with a couple of administrative or comments about what's coming next. So Liz, from General Braus, who is peerless. So this is probably a good test question for you. NATO is currently working on a comprehensive concept for deterrence and defense for the Euro-Atlantic region. Does this concept address those regions which are particularly exposed to a potential Russian military threat, such as the Baltic or Black Sea regions, the importance of rapid reinforcement of allies located there, and how to move reinforcement forces there?
Hello, General. The answer is yes. So no, seriously, the concept has just been submitted to NATO headquarters for discussion amongst the allies at that level. I clearly, on these means, I can't give any detail, but it's got all the right hooks in it. Thank you.
All right, so much for your reputation for being loquacious. All right, so this is the lightning round, and we'll go Greg. No, we'll go the way we started. Tanya, Greg, Liz, and then Jacek. Lightning round, you get 1 minute to make that final big point. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ben. So yeah, to wrap it up, I think putting defense issues on the back burner, I think will mean that we come out of yet another crisis without having learned much. I think there are many key lessons to be learned as we come out of the coronavirus crisis. They certainly include the added value of civ-mil approaches, but also the added value of EU-NATO cooperation for ensuring a much more comprehensive approach to security. Two things to watch out for. I think we should keep an eye on the strategic compass. So the reflection document that the EU is currently preparing, and also keep an eye out tomorrow as the European Commission will present its new budget.
All right, Tanya, we lost you right after the word budget, the word that everybody wanted to hear, and then it froze up. Can you pick that up from the budget
Yes.
coming up?
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened. So very quickly, keep an eye out tomorrow as the Commission is going to present another proposal for the EU's long-term budget. So there we get an indication of where the amounts for military mobility and the European Defence Fund will stand. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I don't anticipate it'll go back up to 6.5 billion euro, but I sure hope it's not going to still be at zero, which is where we are right now. Okay, Greg Meltzer.
Two quick comments. One is, I think some countries like Romania, who are very concerned about their situation, security situation in the Black Sea, are probably going to work very hard to keep the 2%. And I think efforts that you have going here to look at the military mobility will be useful to help figure out what's the best way to spend it, because it's not just having the equipment to fight, it's getting the right things there at the right time. It's important. The other thing I just mentioned, we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but I'll be leading the Balkan a working group in your military mobility workshop, and looking forward to that. It's a very complex region, a lot of challenges. I was looking at the rail networks, and there's just a huge hole that just doesn't even touch that region. So looking forward to getting into this as we go along. Thanks very much.
Yeah, Greg, thanks. In fact, one of the questions I didn't get to ask, but I think your scenario that you'll be leading at the workshop is about 400 kilometers of the Danube River passes through Serbia. And one of our listeners asked about Serbia's willingness to allow NATO material or equipment or something to move along the Danube through Serbia. I think that'll be an interesting factor to take a look at. Okay, back to Group Captain Purcell. You get 1 minute.
Thanks, sir. Okay, so I'd just like to say that this is bigger than military logistics. It's military, it's national, it's civil, it's commercial. It requires nations to take a whole of government approach. And the key phrase that I use all the time is force flow management, being able to keep oversight, coordinate, deconflict, and know what's going on the ground. Because when things start moving, well, it's relatively chaotic. Thank you.
All right, and Dr. Bartosiak, gotcha.
Yes.
Okay, quickly. We are at the new generation war, and strategic mobility and military mobility is the most important factor in the Russian mindset and perception, how we react and how we deter their offensive moves all across the Eastern Front. That's why we need to make sure that we act not reactively, but proactively. And geography of Central and Eastern Europe is creating favorable conditions to do so. Thanks.
Okay, well, let me say all four of you, thanks very much. For everybody, our next panel, the third in our monthly series, will be on 2 June. At that panel, we're going to take a look at the cyber vulnerabilities of our transportation networks, what needs to be done to make sure that airports, seaports, rail networks, and the power generation necessary are all protected from a cyber strike. But we'll also take a look at the Chinese threat, the vulnerability our infrastructure has to Chinese manipulation or control or disruption. And then finally, in the same 2 June panel, we'll shift our sights even a little bit further north and take a look at scenario number 1, which is about moving equipment from Norway through Sweden across the Baltics into Estonia. And we'll also have a panelist that's an expert on exercises and take maybe an historical look at some recent exercises that were done to help improve military mobility. So that's 2 June, that's our next panel. 26 May, CEPA will roll out our next report entitled One Flank, One Threat, One Presence, a strategy for strengthening NATO's eastern flank. And it's all about improving the coherence of NATO's eastern flank and specifically elevating the greater Black Sea region up to, so you don't have tailored forward presence and enhanced forward presence, but instead getting coherence along our eastern flank. And then, of course, again, a reminder, we anticipate conducting our military mobility workshop in October in Brussels. Best wishes to everybody for continued good health. Thanks for listening in, and thanks again for our panel of experts and practitioners. Thanks all of you.